both consummate musicians and artists, but have been tireless in promoting and advocating new music, I think, for your whole career. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but I want to also start with your association, because that goes way back with Peter.
Yes, it goes back to the dawn of
Tashi
time.
Or something.
Even before that,
Even
it
before
goes
that.
back. It's almost 50 years now. I think we first met in '68, as far as I can tell. 68, he guessed it. Okay, so it's a long time, and it's been, we've been friends and we've been colleagues, and things have happened. Many momentous and unmomentous occasions happened, and played thousands of concerts.
Right, and you've sort of had, in terms of this particular aspect too of contemporary music, sort of parallel tracks, not exactly the same, and interest in a certain body of music to the three composers I think we have on here tonight, are that you've both played for many decades. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think, maybe not the same amount exactly of the different three of the individual ones, but yeah, an interest in their music. And, I feel like the composers that I played with were my teachers, and those three were particularly teachers, but there were others as well. And I even have a kind of, my imaginary friend, Arnold Schoenberg, is always lurking in the back of my mind, the things that he said and wrote, and the music, of course, that I played of his many, many times.
Which you played a lot and just did the string quartets, a recording, is that right?
Yeah, I've recorded all four string quartets, the string trio, and much of the other chamber music.
Right, and so what does it feel like going back to '68 and the music scene? And again, you probably all know he was at Lincoln Chamber Music Society, and programming new music sometimes, how could we say this, had its ups and downs,
Yes.
or
Mainly it's
complexities.
downs.
Yeah. And so how does it seem today compared, in terms of your musical life and playing contemporary music and the scene in general?
Well, it's so different, and I remember Sebastian Currier, the young composer, coming up at Juilliard, and I remember, I think I was sneaking into Alice Tully Hall one day, and I thought, wow, there's a wonderful pianist playing this guy. Who is this guy? And then we became friends back that far, and I played your music a number of times, and always with great pleasure.
Indeed, and conducted too, right?
That's right. That the funny the science
Night
fiction
Maze,
piece, yeah. So that it's, the funny thing is that in 1968 or around that time, Milton Babbitt was probably the most famous American composer, and he cut a wide swath through the music world. And some people were envious, and some people were mad, and some people were delighted that he was a part of the scene. And then as time went on, then there was a moment when George Crumb was the most famous composer, and then Philip Glass became the most famous composer, and the scene was always changing, and that was the thing that struck me most. People say, oh, well, there was that period when the 12-tone people held sway over all of music. I said, no way. Music never stops growing. It wasn't real. That music never stops growing, and there have always been very conservative composers working alongside very modern composers, and one of the great examples of that is Richard Strauss and Arnold Schoenberg.
Right, going back. So it's this long, august history of overlapping like that. And what do you think, aside about audiences then, too, in terms of how people relate to hearing you play Babbitt? Has that changed over time, or Carter?
Sure has, and it's much. By the way, audiences were quite small often. I remember
That's true. I remember. So there's like Miller Theater concerts with 12 people. It's like,
yeah. And then before, at one time there were a great number of them also, but it would change. And then I remember somebody said, I think it might have been Charles Wourinen, said, "There's somebody out there that I don't know."
What's going on here?
What's going on? Somebody stumbled in from the outside into our inner sanctum. But then things opened up, and because there was a period when, I think it was said, believe it or not, that when Igor Stravinsky died, that there was no great composer alive after his passing. And I can tell you this because I know it for a fact, is Robert Kraft once mentioned to me that when he was first working with Stravinsky in the late 40s, that he mentioned to somebody, said, "You mean the guy that wrote The Rite of Spring is still alive?" And
It had been a while, right?
Yeah, it's just that's the way the scene changes, and it could happen to all of us.
Yeah, certainly.
We're all going to go to the same place.
Yeah, and so of course I want to talk about the Beethoven, but just let's talk about all three of the new pieces. And of course you didn't play the Wourinen, but you've played a lot of his music.
Tremendous amount, yes.
Yeah, so you want to tell us maybe a little bit about him and give a context and
Well,
for this
it's an
piece?
interesting, yeah, it is. Wourinen grew up in Columbia University. His father was the head of the history department, and he was a boy soprano and would do stuff at the City Opera, and he was, he would sing in Lizzie Borden and things like, Jack Beeson and stuff by Douglas Moore, and then he became a student of the two composers who were at Columbia at the time, Otto Luning and Vladimir Ussachevsky, and then he was never a student of Milton, but he learned a tremendous amount from Babbitt. And he was always, and I was going to say, and I was almost going to write something about it at one time, that those three composers, Carter, Wourinen, and Babbitt, were very interested in each other. And so they would always ask Carroll or me, he said, "What's Charles doing?" "Have you seen Eliot lately? What's Milton up to?" And they would ask us because they didn't want to call each other so much, because it was a little bit, although they were all close, and especially Milton and Eliot were very close at different times, that it was a little bit, the magnet where the like pulls is a little bit of repelling.
Well, right, of both.
Yeah,
They were comrades and competitive at the same time somehow, is that they sort of shared a viewpoint.
Yeah,
But,
like, how come he's doing that and I'm not doing that? And I think that Wourinen is a 12-tone master, and he's also a harmonic master, as you can tell by that adagio, that the ability to create harmony like that and in colors and rich textures, that's Wourinen is very good at that. And Babbitt is good at something else, which is, I like to think of it that Babbitt is the composer that actually talks to you, and that it's happened a couple of times when I played this piece, the More Melismata, that people said, "That composer was talking to me, and you were talking to me through the music," and it has a kind of, what would you call it, a discursive quality.
Right, I suppose so. I was struck actually in terms of between the Carter and the Babbitt, how different their personalities come out so much in those pieces as that. And I don't know if I would have said that it was, because in a way,
I didn't mean discursive in a bad way.
Yeah, no, I know you did.
Discourse. He's telling you a story with the music, and the ability of Milton to come up with stuff is amazing. And then Eliot, I think of as kind of the dramatic master of the three. He's the one who puts things together, and that figment, sometimes you think, this isn't going to make any sense. And then, no, it was right. He puts elements of music together that really nobody else would
absolutely
do.
Compared to the Babbitt, the sort of the
Yes.
gestural language and the unexpected things and the different figurations, versus the Babbitt scopes out this smaller space and really gets involved in it. And one question I have for you about the Babbitt too, and when we're talking about this repertoire, what do you this piece is structured serial somehow. Is that something that you pay attention to as a performer at all, or aware of, or have parts of that you deal with, or how to give us a sense of that?
Yeah, I do, and in the case of the Babbitt, I did study the set, and I looked at all of his. I was lucky to go to the Library of Congress and get a copy of all of his sketches for this piece, because some of these, we were talking about at rehearsals, Peter and I, about this thing that with the composers. One of Milton's students said, "Well, he made some mistakes in here, and I corrected them." I said, "Yeah, but I looked at this material from the library, and it's very clear that he wrote it, the set was written out, of course the 12-tone material was written out, but then in both the sketch and the manuscript, he wrote it out that way. So is it possible that Milton's mistakes, if they are mistakes at all, are better than your corrections?"
Right.
Which is,
could be, and they might not be mistakes, because I think he's assuming some sort of row thing that he expected, some expected outcome, but there could have been some more complicated reasoning behind it, right?
And he could have thought, I don't know, I might just go apart from the row. Schoenberg did it too. People try to correct some notes in Arnold Schoenberg's music, and then, I don't know who said it, but said, Arnold Schoenberg does not make mistakes.
Right. Well, truth be told, they did that with Beethoven, right? There were these cases where they changed, was it the violin concerto, I think? They changed C sharp to E flats to E naturals and so on, just because they thought
and
must be a
Haydn, they
mistake.
took out the big long rest, those Haydn would pause for 2 bars, but he couldn't have meant that. He must have just meant 1 bar. So we'll just take out a second bar.
Exactly. Yeah. So it always happens, and everybody, of course, is fallible, and it could have been a mistake.
And then the other thing that, if you can comment on this, I'll ask you a question now, because sometimes when people say, well, I looked at the manuscript and it said X and Y, and then I looked at the first edition and it said Z. So, but there are times, especially in the old days, that the manuscript wasn't thought to be of great value. Maybe it was to the composer, but not to everybody else. So there was a change made, and the composer authorized the edition to be in a certain form, but it doesn't agree with the manuscript. Has that happened to you?
Well, obviously, of course, because, I mean, well, now you use computer too, but yeah, you might end up making a change with your publisher that you want, but then if somebody went back and looked at the score you had originally sent in, which was quote-unquote the original, it would still be the other way.
Because you wouldn't go back and change the manuscript to agree with the printed version.
Exactly. And as you know, the history is littered with complexities of that too, and pieces like Schumann, who left out these symphonic etudes that people play anyways, even though he doesn't want them played, and so that's something one could always sort of has a complex history. But Ed, tell me about the Beethovens now. Let's talk about them. And first, but give a context now. I don't know. There's gamba sonatas of Bach and baritone sonatas of Haydn, but really, I mean, are there cello sonatas before Beethoven's 5 sonatas that are in the repertoire?
That's a good question. Are there cello sonatas before? Because the gamba sonatas are not really for cello. They're
exactly.
very specifically written for viola da gamba, which has a different kind of tuning.
And a different history of performance and everything.
Yeah. Okay, cello sonatas before. There were some. There was a certain, I mean, there was our patron saint, Luigi Boccherini.
Of course.
Wrote thousands of them.
There we go. That's true. So Boccherini.
There were cello pieces, but I think these are maybe the first big important pieces. Mozart never wrote any. Haydn wrote great cello parts in quartets and trios and many other situations. He wrote beautiful solos. The Sinfonia Concertante goes up very high on the cello register. That was probably the first piece that went up into the stratosphere, as we call it.
Right. Wait, that's the concerto you mean? Or no?
It was the Sinfonia Concertante.
But the Haydn concerto is very high, too.
But I don't think he wrote that.
Oh, he didn't write that.
I don't think he wrote it. Everybody else says he wrote it. I don't think he wrote it. Fine.
I wouldn't take it. Who knows?
I don't want to go against my colleagues, but it doesn't seem like it's Haydn to me.
Interesting. And of course, that was a time when everybody was attributing pieces to Haydn around that time. Right?
Yes, and also even in the case of J.S. Bach, he wrote the 4 piano concerto or the 4 keyboard concerto is by Vivaldi. It's the exact same piece. I don't think he changed. Maybe he changed some things in it. I don't know.
Barely at all. Yeah. And of course, so these are the last 2 of Beethoven's 5 cello sonatas and sort of the early, late period of Beethoven. And you were mentioning your notes about, I think, does it say in a freestyle, he refers to the sonata structure?
Especially the number,
number 1. So
sonata,
tell us a little bit about that.
Well, only that the free sonata, and it does, I don't know if anybody would agree that if you looked at the music to Opus 101, the piece that preceded it for piano.
Similar aspects. Yeah.
Similar aspects in the way that things move around formally, and that the ornamentation and all that stuff is spectacular. And it's a very, I mean, the first one has an agitated quality because of the A minor maybe, and it does crazy accents and all that, but overall the piece has a smile on its face, and then the D major is the exact opposite, and it's full of, powerful drive, and there the form is, well, it's quite clear, and then the crazy fugue at the end. Who would have guessed that he could go that far and go to far-ranging keys and all that, which he was so good at.
And I guess preceded Opus 106, the Hammer Clavier.
Yes.
And of course, 101 has fugal elements, so sort of like, but it wasn't really a fugue at that point.
Yes, but he also wrote the Opus 59, number 3, the string quartet, fourth movement, is a really solid fugue. And he probably did some other ones I'm not thinking clearly, but.
Those, I mean, extended fugatos in sections, even the Eroica symphonies and like various different things have these fugal parts. But and how is it playing those 2 pieces? Tell us a little bit about performance and with piano.
It comes out of this period when even in Haydn's time, what we call the piano trios now were called sonatas with violin and cello. And Beethoven even at one time said about Opus 102 numbers 1 and 2 that they're sonatas with cello obbligato. Right. But I mean the cello parts are really very different to play. They're scarily different. Because the first one is quite lyrical, the second one has lyrical elements to it, but stays much lower in tessitura in general, and the other one stays quite a bit higher, and also it's like the playing couldn't be more different in quality.
Between
not
the two
just-
sonatas,
Between
you
the two
mean?
sonatas,
Right,
and he wrote it for this guy, Joseph Link, who was supposed to be a wonderful player, and Beethoven said something, he said, he's an amusing player, but he's a gossip.
Wonder what that meant.
Saying bad things about Beethoven.
Beethoven, probably, yeah, exactly. Great. Maybe I could try, does anybody have any questions for Fred about pieces tonight or anything? Or
Something else.
Yeah, or something else?
I was privileged to be at the Elliott Carter Festival at Tanglewood that week.
Yes.
We came and went, and were there the whole time, and was like the father of the whole program.
Yes.
And they had an exhibition of his music, and I'd never seen anything like that. Some of the pieces where he told you exactly how long everything was supposed to be, and he had these markers, and it was very geometrical.
Yes.
And then I said, and then he had a chat back. So I said, is there any possibility for this is why you come in, because you played a lot of his music. I said, did the performers get to interpret anything? I said, so methodical. Where does the humanity or the personality of the artist come in? And then Ursula was around, and
Yes.
you were around, and he said, well, I trust them. I know those people, and I trust them, and so it's a question I have. He's very methodical.
Yes.
And then he gives the music to you, and you have to interpret it your way.
Well, I can tell you about that part of it. The methodical part, he did sketch quite a bit, and he would work out large scale rhythmic formats in his pieces, so that there was a piece, just a short piece called with thoughtful lightness, I guess would really be a better way to say it, called Leggerezza Pensosa. And the cello's always in 5, and the clarinet's always in 3, and the violin's always in 4, and it's kind of like a grid where you hit on those things. But don't forget that our friend and the greatest one, J.S. Bach, often he would put all the bar lines in a piece of music at the beginning. He would rule them all out. And I remember, this is a funny story. You know that famous sign, it's always a joke. It says, plan ahead. And then it turns out there's not enough room to say the word ahead. In the 5th Brandenburg Concerto, there's all those 30-second notes in the harpsichord part. And he just runs out of space. So he just writes a big bubble in the bar line and writes the notes into the next bar. So it's the idea of having a grid or a template for a piece of music is not at all new. And as far as the other part goes, is I played for Elliott Carter many times, and sometimes he would say, Fred, why doesn't that sound better? And I was thinking, I got to practice some more. And he said, okay, come back and play it for me again. And then after I've been playing for him for a long time, he said, don't come back and play this piece for me anymore. You know it better than I do, which was not true, by the way, but he said it because he didn't want to hear me play the cello sonata anymore. And with the Figment, he was very particular about certain places, like the first 3 notes, about how he wanted them long and short and marcato and certain things. And other places he would say, oh, it's interesting what you do there. I never thought of that. So I think he was he could be very specific and very generous about how one performed his music.
Right, and maybe you could follow up with that same question in terms of Babbitt, which, it would seem to me, no matter what, there's always room for interpretation. And so, in any instance, right?
Especially with Milton himself, because I coached with Milton a number of times, and he would say, sometimes I'd say, Milton, what should I do? He said, anyway, if anybody ever knew Babbitt, he had the special voice, Fred, my boy, you know what to do. And I was thinking, no, I don't.
He always did things like that.
He wouldn't say anything. But also, Milton was famous. If he'd come to this concert, he would say, nobody could do that the way you did it tonight.
Right, those ambiguous.
What does that mean exactly?
Yes. Yeah, he had a whole catalog of things to say afterward if you didn't particularly like something. Yeah, that's right. Anybody else?
We don't have to have any more questions, but it doesn't have to be about music. It could be about another subject.
What other subject would you like to talk about? Physics or
No. Recipes, cooking.
Well, for a topic, how about reminiscences of barge music, which we were just talking about?
Oh, barge music was a wonderful place where I played. I don't even know. I couldn't say how many hundreds of times from about. I'm trying to think. 1984 till 2000 and something, or even earlier.
I don't know if most of you know,
Oh, yeah.
so barge music is this actual boat in Brooklyn.
Yeah, it floats in the East River.
Which floats in the East River, and of course, when a boat goes by, suddenly you're like, like that, it can be a little disconcerting. Yeah.
I do remember that a gallant Frenchman once opened the front door, which was actually the back door. That's how people came in, and it did one of those rock things, and he fell in the water.
Really?
And in the East River, and we fished him out and said, look, you've got to go to the hospital. He said, no, I'm fine. If I feel fine. He said, yeah, but this water is toxic, so you've got to go get treated. And we had many beautiful times there, and also before and after the concerts. And I was thinking about, well, I wasn't thinking about it now, but just when you said it, I was thinking about the barge the night that it snowed maybe 10 inches in Brooklyn, and I called Olga Bloom, the woman who ran it, and said, Olga, are we going to play tonight? She said, yes, we are. Come on down. And people showed up, too. Thanks to you for coming in the bad weather.
Exactly. Great. One last question, maybe I'll ask is, what's next for you? What are your concerns these days?
I told you about it before. I'm writing this. It's supposed to be the grand treatise on string technique, and the reason I started doing it is I realized that there have been no advances in teaching books for string players. It's wind players have had them, percussionists have. I'm not sure. Piano people they have the greatest etudes. Pianists have the most wonderful etudes of all instruments, and the cello or the strings in general are lagging behind. So I try to take a number of contemporary ideas of music and link them together with the music of the past. And I always, whenever I knocked off somebody's exercise, I gave him credit, whether it's Carl Flesch or Kosman or Paganini or even Brahms, because Brahms wrote those, I think they're 51 exercises for the piano. I used one of those as a jumping off spot. So that's what's occupying most of my time now.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much. It was really, really fantastic.
Thanks,
Great to
Sebastian.
talk to you.
Thanks for coming.